In this pulsar star song, shell psalm, fish serenade beneath the waves, in that darkness in which selenic light casts the shadows of fronds and bridges upon the water. Perhaps you can sense me. You can use the names they've given me to help the unfamiliar understand. Meanwhile, fish daughter, Kadal Kanni, sea maiden, mermaid. You can use the one I like dearest, the one someone I loved called me, Samudra Rani, queen of the oceans, or you can call me by my own.
Welcome to The Subverse. I'm your host, Susan Matthews. This is a podcast where we journey from the cosmic to the quantum, from forest soundscapes to fragile oceans. Continuing with our theme of water this season, this episode is a conversation with Sharanya Manivannan, who writes and illustrates fiction, poetry, and non-fiction for children and adults. Her two most recent books are the graphic novels Incantations Over Water and the picture book Mermaids In The Moonlight, and these were the subject of our conversation. In these books, she introduces Ila, a mermaid in Mattakalappu or Batticaloa on the northeastern shore of Sri Lanka. We find a lagoon teeming with magic, and for those who live there, the idea of fish-tailed women is not out of the realm of possibility. However, when Sharanya goes looking, the tales are missing. So she breathes life into them in these beautifully illustrated and worded books, introducing us to these stories and to mermaids all over, covering so much rich myth and folklore. These are definitely stories made out of water, and we are gifted with wonderful pearls of wisdom from the deep. Unfortunately, there is a twist in this tale. Incantations Over Water, which was published in December 2021, is now out of print, and so is Mermaids in the Moonlight. Westland, the publisher that released both books, was closed by Amazon earlier this year. So for now, we will have to wait with the patience of Ila for these books to return to us. Some magic conjured up by the sea, we hope, will do the trick. We thank Sharanya for the excerpt she read for the podcast. Sharanya, welcome to The Subverse. It's so exciting to have you join us today for this discussion.
Thank you for having me, Susan. It's really my pleasure, and I'm looking forward to our chat.
Thank you. I am so excited to discuss two wonderful books that you've written. The first is Mermaids in the Moonlight, and the second is Incantations Over Water, a wonderful, dreamy duology. I spent some very, very precious hours reading both books and enjoying the amazing artwork also that is featured in the book. It's a pity that I can't sort of describe it to our listeners, but I'm hoping that this conversation will entice them to go and see for themselves. In the book, you have a wonderful protagonist, a mermaid, Ila. And I am so curious to hear about what kind of inspired the creation of Ila and her stories.
Thank you so much, Susan. The genesis for this duology really began because my family comes from Batticaloa in the east of Sri Lanka, also known as Mattakalappu, on the island of Ilangai. And as members of the traumatized Tamil diaspora, we left the island in 1990. So I grew up largely outside of Ilangai, and I didn't personally get a chance to go to Mattakalappu until I was 27 years old. And when I did, I noticed that there were mermaid figures everywhere, all over town on the public facades. I remembered how, when I was a child, when we had seen Disney's The Little Mermaid, my mother had said that there was a mermaid in her hometown who sang on full moon nights. And seeing the mermaid motifs, the Meenmagal motifs all over Batticaloa, I realized that that was not just something that she had said on the basis of an animated film that her children had just seen, but that there was something else to it. And this stayed with me. And the presence of the mermaids all over Batticaloa stayed with me. They did make their way into my fiction in my short story collection, The High Priestess Never Marries. But shortly after that book was published, I went to Sri Lanka again after a gap of 4 years, and I knew that the mermaids were not finished with me. I knew there was more. And this question of why the mermaids were all over town did not seem to be lore about them, at least none that I'd been aware of, none I'd heard when I was growing up. I was very intrigued by this. And I decided to pursue the folklore. I wanted to find out what the stories were, because how can you have a mythic figure and not have stories about her? That seemed so counterintuitive to me. Sort of went in with the assumption that there were stories that perhaps had not been recorded in English or entered the mainstream, or which possibly were among the erased narratives of the Civil War. But I was wrong on all these counts. I went to Batticaloa and I kept going back and I kept looking for these stories, and I found out right away that actually the stories had not entered folklore. If they were told in homes, because surely I'm not the first person to have done so, then they stayed in those homes. They stayed in the dialogues between grandmother and grandchild, perhaps. I asked people who lived there, who'd grown up there, what were the stories you told each other as children? And over again, what I came up against was a kind of acceptance, that the mean muggle was just a part of the town, and nobody really thought too much about her. Which then raised many other questions about why, which had many other answers. One of which is, if you, the people you love, the people you live with, the place you live in, is under a state of continuous emergency for decades on end, are you really thinking about the mermaids? Or are you thinking about survival? Are you thinking about your losses, perhaps, or what is going on, or just day-to-day life? So there was that aspect of it. But that's actually the more mundane aspect. There is a more magical aspect to it, which is that this place, Mattakalappu, is a very unusual place. There is a prevalence of belief and faith in magic, in ritual, in the ways in which the human will can impose itself onto other people's realities through malintention. There is all of this. There are all kinds of spiritual systems and also, informal practices in this place. So it is not so unusual, actually, if there happen to be mermaids in the lagoon who sing on full moon nights. Well, that fits right in to everything else. It was really intriguing to me to discover that the culture I had grown up in, which I thought was restricted to the dysfunction of my own family, was actually a widespread culture with a system of beliefs, as I said, and a way of engaging with the world which defies many kinds of categorizations and rationalizations. And so from that folkloric void came Mermaids in the Moonlight and Incantations Over Water.
It's so fascinating, and it's so interesting to also hear about how the folklore itself was kind of almost submerged in this place.
And to create the folklore, because the stories were just not there. And I asked such a widespread cross section of people. I asked fisher people, I asked academics, I asked scientific researchers, I asked writers, I asked just homemakers, just everybody whom I encountered. And the stories are just not there to begin with. And that to me is really intriguing. Like, this book is just right next to me. The mermaids are just everywhere. This book is a history of Batticaloa. And there's one right on the cover, but not on the inside the pages. Hiding in plain sight as you enter Batticaloa, there's an arch, which is in both books, where there are mermaids sitting on top of the arch, welcoming visitors in. Just everywhere, pillars, clock towers. I've seen a little mermaid perched on top of a shrine, you know, just everywhere in plain sight.
One thing I loved in the book, and both books, one thing I loved is not only Ila's voice, which is present in both books and is so vivid, but it's also how she tells the stories of other mermaids in other places. And that's something I really loved. And you really took us on a journey all over the world in this one. You must have done a lot of research in looking at these myths and stories in other places, and I'd be fascinated to know a little bit more.
I did do a lot of research, and it was very pleasurable for me as a reader more than anything else, and as a lover of stories. And one of the most interesting things is that mermaids are not Eurocentric. We think of them as Eurocentric because we really only know Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, and then we know Disney's happy adaptation of that very sad story, but they're not Eurocentric. They exist across so many cultures, so many continents, and these are just the human renditions of these stories. And they also exist in places where you wouldn't think they would, landlocked places, for example. And there's something about that motif which has been recurrent across cultures, across different story lineages. And I wanted these stories because, to me, honoring the folkloric void in Mattakalappu meant, in some ways, honoring the existence of a canon which is highly under-recognized. Something which I've heard repeatedly from readers of Mermaids in the Moonlight is that they didn't know that there were any other mermaids other than the Disney version. In some ways, I want these two books to help more readers find those stories. I found them because I am a reader. The only mermaid story I had to invent was Ila's. The rest of them are there if you just care to look, and there are so many more. There are so many more. Just a fraction of them made it into these two books.
It's very difficult for me to actually choose my favorite. I was so fascinated with kind of the range of it. One thing that really struck me in many of the stories, especially in the love stories, is how the mermaid would meet a human, and then there would be kind of betrayal and heartbreak. And that seemed to kind of recur when you were writing these stories. I mean, did you find often that there's a lot of this violence and betrayal that really kind of recurs?
Yeah, I did find that. And then in between, there are also the happy mermaid stories, some romantic, of course. I think, like all stories that survive and are passed down from generation to generation, there is an element of pathos, there is an element of self recognition in certain stories that makes them especially timeless. And I think, for instance, the stories of mermaids who are trapped on land because their lovers or partners decide to steal their sealskin or steal their magical red cap, or whatever ornament may protect their identity and integrity. I think it's very clear why stories like that exist and continue to be passed on. People do recognize themselves and recognize their circumstances in stories like that. There is also the great fear of the unknown, which these stories reflect. And the mermaid is a feminine motif. The fear of the autonomous woman, the fear of the desirous woman, all these elements are very much at play in many mermaid stories.
We'll be back after a break. This season of our podcast, we're trying to focus on the theme of water. And the ideas that I've been exploring is sort of looking at this whole notion of fluidity and hybridity. And especially when it comes to mermaid, you're talking about these hybrid beings. And it is fascinating in terms of how we as humans also kind of encounter hybridity. And like you said, and part of it is this fear of the unknown and fear of difference and something which is dissimilar from us. Do you feel there is something specifically about water which allows for this hybridity and these kind of mixing of shapes and blending of bodies?
We all come from water, and we are mostly made up of water. It's literally elemental to who we are and how we are composed. And perhaps as an element, it does have the qualities that you attribute to it, a kind of capaciousness for changing things, for shifting things, for hybrid and nebulous kinds of things. And one of the things that I really enjoyed in the course of my research was realizing that we are never going to know in our lifetimes just how much life there is in the deep, deep sea. We're constantly finding out. And I think that's beautiful. I think that mystery and a comfort with what we cannot know are very important and beautiful things. There's humility in it, there's reverence in it, but there's also a perception of the self as being part of something larger, rather than everything can be known, everything can be controlled, everything can be understood. And really, I think that's one of the things that personally draws me to mermaids. I love this idea that they don't want us to see them, they don't want us to know. We have no right as human beings. What will we do? We'll just put them in cages, we'll just exhibit them. And they have sentience and intelligence, and they just don't want us to have them. I love that concept. Absolutely. And if they do exist, then, using that sentience and using that intelligence, why on earth would they want human beings to have access to them? I think it is certainly interesting that they do exist in so many stories. There's so many stories of human interaction with mermaids.
One question I had, Sharanya, is in the book you write of the 2004 tsunami. And here you write, when the water stripped back like linen to reveal its bed, and afterwards, beings that would resist record lay stranded briefly. You compare it to an intense event where we are temporarily given a glimpse into that which we do not yet know. Nothing of the calm that follows gives away the revelation that came or the devastation that remained. So it is also sometimes when it comes to encounters with the mayor. I just loved that section so much. And also because in the book you speak about the war and you speak about the tsunami. I would really love to hear more about what kind of inspired this in the book.
Batticaloa was very badly affected by the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004. And I felt that it was not really possible to tell the story of this landscape and this waterscape without acknowledging this devastating event. And I kept thinking about it from the perspective of a marine creature mostly, because Ila is one. She is a marine being. And what her experience of it could be like, especially because Ila, as a character, has a very strong curiosity and even longing for human interaction, which may make her a little different from many of the mermaids whom she talks about. And so I just wondered what that experience would have been like for her, especially as it would have allowed her to go to land, really, to ride the wave in if she wanted to. And that's explored in the book, what she decides to do. The ecological devastation, the human devastation, the devastation to all living species, I felt it had to be acknowledged. I just thought that it was a very important note that had to be in the book. And I think one of the things which I really, really thought about a lot while creating these works was about narratives. What are dominant narratives? How do they come to become dominant narratives? What are the stories which are purposely erased, the stories which do not have place because they complicate things so much? And that is something that keeps coming up in the book as well, because it's modernity perhaps, but really also how do we keep records? How do we judge the past and therefore impact the present and the future? And especially in terms of the Civil War and the dichotomized narratives around it, that was something which I wanted to explore in the book as well. Another thing is how, people really don't know about Batticaloa. Batticaloa is very much erased by the dominant northern Tamil Jaffna narrative. There are many people who really behave as though Jaffna is the capital of Batticaloa when it's a completely different region with its distinct culture, distinct identity, and a long standing rivalry exists between these two regions within which are multiple communities. There is a kind of monolithic idea of what it means to be Tamil on the island, which is very, very dangerous. And that is one of the things that I wanted to, to explore, if not challenge, in Incantations in particular.
The more we're talking, I'm also beginning to see the layers in this book. I think I have to now go back and read it again with very different eyes. I have to repeat this again to listeners. Reading the words is one thing, but also looking at the amazing artwork, the two combined together. There's a lot that you say in the art.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad that you've enjoyed the illustrations as well.
I'm curious a little bit about the process. The illustrations come to mind first and then the words. I'm curious in terms of how that hybrid worked.
So I made Mermaids in the Moonlight first, and I learned a lot along the way because that was my switch to digital illustration after having painted by hand for many years, just, really for myself. And I started with the text draft and created a storyboard and, made the art. And when it came to the final edits, I discovered that the illustrator in me had a much stronger voice than the writer. And for the sake of the illustration, I edited the text in, in different ways. So that was all of those things were learning experiences from Mermaids in the Moonlight. When it came to making incantations, I knew going into it that I wanted a simpler color palette because there were just going to be so many more pages. And I wanted to play with concepts similar to indigo fabric or cyanotype imagery, which just uses kind of whites and blues and a few hints of color. So I wanted to simplify the palette, that I knew. But first I had to create the text. And I was humbled by that process because I really went into it thinking, I'm sure it's just a couple of weeks worth of intensive, immersive work, and I'll have my textual manuscript ready. It was not like that at all. It took me about 3 months to create the text. And sometimes it was a paragraph a day. It was at such a slow pace, which was very challenging, but also very, very immersive, you know. And then the illustrations also only took about 3 months, which was so surprising. Sometimes I did 3 or 4 pages of art a day. It just flowed. And it was such pleasure and such solace So, yeah, that was the process.
Beautiful. I love the way you described it. Sharanya, I have to ask about the publishing of Incantations Over Water. I'm sure that some of our listeners will be familiar with what's happened in relation to Westland publishing in India. And I just would like you to share your own experience in this regard and also what your plans are, for your next upcoming projects.
The sudden shutdown of Westland Books was such a devastating thing, and in many ways it still is, because I think there's a sense of instability, insecurity that has set into a lot of authors, to many authors rather, who've worked with this publisher. And Westland are lovely. They're a great publisher to work with. But that this could happen to them was very disillusioning for many, many authors. What's happened now is that they've announced that they will regroup under a new company, hopefully sometime this year. They've also said that former Westland authors who would like to bring their books back into print with them should have a home. So, on a personal level, this is very comforting because I just I do not have the bandwidth or the energy to pitch or anything like that. And there are other aspects of how this has impacted different publishers in India, a lot of which I am not really at liberty to discuss, but it has had a widespread effect. So, right now, how I'm feeling is I'm just sort of sitting back a little bit. Ultimately, as with so many other things in this capitalistic world, it comes down to logistics and budgets and corporate agendas and so many other things. So, a lot remains to be seen. I don't know what the future of my Ila duology is for sure. And I've done this work, I've been in this field too long to be optimistic, without things being formal. As for how it's impacted me, it has severely demoralized me in ways which I can't even quite put into words just yet. I don't know when I will be able to get back to my creative projects. And I'm someone who always has 5 or 6 manuscripts going at the same time. And I love working on something immersively for a little while and then working on something else and allowing the silences to teach me and to inform the manuscript. But the last few months, I've really just been in a place of I can't even think about creation. I can't even imagine doing that again. So, on a personal level, it will definitely take some time. I don't know how much time to get back into it. And I would also like to say at this point that I hope that the Westland closure has revealed some things to readers about the publishing industry, about how it is a corporate field, about how writers don't make a living from it. So, there are, at any given time, we're all working with so much else personally, professionally, financially, and we're doing that even as we're creating. And so, when a setback like this happens, it does force recalibration. So I'm in that recalibration place right now. I'm disillusioned, I'm demoralized. I want so much to just be back in my creative work. But I also know that if I was to force myself and not honor the reality of how I'm feeling, I wouldn't really get the pleasure that I always do from it. So I'm just honoring that.
Sharanya, thank you so much for sharing this with us. I'm really very moved and I'm so sorry that you've been through something like this. I think explains so well that we forget how publishing is such a capitalist industry and also how predatory it is in so many ways. And all I can do is really wish you some time and some rest. And I'm sure, that in time you will be spinning some beautiful other worlds of magic and light for all of us. But definitely, I hope you can take some rest, because I think you've been through kind of an exhausting couple of months. And there are plenty of us out here who are big fans. So anytime you need anything, you just let us know.
That's so sweet of you, Susan. Thank you for that. I just want to reiterate that it's not just me. This is an experience that many authors have had. And, all of this has been happening during a pandemic. There have been innumerable personal costs and losses and so many things which we've also all been going through. And then, at least for me, I know this for sure, and I know it to be true for others as well. The solace that making these two books gave me during a couple of incredibly difficult years in my personal life, I keep going back to that thought that, no matter what, that's what the books did for me, even though they're out of print at present. But yeah, I think it's just very hard having experienced a setback like this to come back with more books, or even for some authors, they may or may not want to bring their books back into print. Like it throws up a lot of even existential questions. But I warmly invite readers to contemplate these questions as well, because in order to change the publishing industry, to make it more equitable to the creators on whose lifeblood it runs, I think readers need to get involved, and that begins with being informed.
Thank you. I'm sure that our listeners and I definitely have heard you and will be really thinking about these things more deeply. Sometimes we just take the act of reading for granted. But after this experience, I have also realized how precious these books are. So thank you so much. It's been so wonderful to have you join us, Sharanya, and I'm actually looking forward to reading your other book. I did manage to get a copy of The High Priestess Never Marries, so that'll be my next read. I hope that we can also be in touch on other projects that we do on our website, and I wish you all the best and lots of magic in your life.
Thank you so much, Susan. It's really been lovely chatting with you, and wishing you all the same. All the good magic, all the benevolent magic and beautiful things that your heart desires.
Invocations always to the mother of the first waters, Yemanja of the Cowries. She of the white roses, she of the meridians of the body and the splendor of the moon, she of the rivers, she of the sea. She whose amniotic waters all humanity was birthed from, those who walked the continents, those who crossed the oceans, those who could stay, those who were led away. She of the sea. She does not need a story, for she is all stories.
Thanks to Sharanya Manivannan for sharing her thoughts with us. The Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures, with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. If you like the show, please tell a friend and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. The Subverse is produced for us by Waka Media. So long, and thanks for listening.